Welcome to everyone. I'm super excited to be with you today and supporting you in your journey of at least understanding more about our approach to organizational design and management. Just to add to what Alex said, everything that I'll be talking about today, you'll get a copy of. So just feel free to take notes, but also just kind of be present, because the intention is to help you see why we think this approach actually creates more potential in organizations, teams, and the communities that you're all a part of. And just thankful that there is a growing group of people who want to continue to dive into this kind of work, and really want to honor that In Rhythm is really a result of a lot of people's work. And we just want for a moment just to say thank you to those who have invested in me personally, in the work that we're doing collectively, because it really has supported what is coming out today. And so thank you on that. So with that, we're going to and Alex has already started doing this with you a little bit. We're going to jump into, so what brought you here today, and why is this topic meaningful to you? And so maybe Alex or Jen would be great to just mention some of the things that are in the chat function as a means to capture some people's reasons for being here.
Absolutely. When the responses come in, we can read them out. People probably need a minute to type.
Well, we see Murray said, transforming my workplace in the dairy industry. So thanks, Murray.
Nice. Yeah, we'd love to hear from others. What brought you here today? Why is this topic meaningful to you?
I think we're going to go into a season where resilient and regenerative organizations will be the norm, hopefully, and especially in light of everything that's going on now. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see and exciting. I hope a lot of things, good things emerge.
Love it. We're hearing some others from Josh, new interest in region agriculture, how these principles could be applied more broadly. Michael says we need to regenerate healthcare post-COVID. Love it.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks again. As these just gives you a context for why people are jumping into this conversation. And we're going to dive deeply into it as a part of our work today. So with that in mind, one of the things I want you to keep in mind is what really is the intention for what we're trying to do. And so this is kind of some of the expectations. We're going to really talk about what the state of organizations are today, and talk through kind of an alternative design using living systems as that design. Then we're going to talk about what designing with living systems principles may look like, and then a little bit about a framework that we've developed to support people in this journey and transition and design. And then hopefully a little room for discussion. So that will be some of it. And as Alex said, some of you may have been in some of our webinars before, so it may be a review. Some of this will be a review, and I hope that's meaningful to you. And for some of you, this is the first time. Hang on for the ride. So what is the dominant metaphor shaping organizations today? Just type into your chat field. What's the dominant metaphor for shaping organizations today?
We've got some responses coming in. Profit first, immune system, machine.
Great. Some of you are very progressive. I appreciate the immune system comment. It's really what I would want it to be. But yes, I think we see this profit being a major driver of how machines or how organizations are designed. And then Ryan Johnson says machines. And so part of what we see as the primary paradigm is this idea that we recognize that we're machines. And it really has captivated most of our thinking, and more than we realize, all of our design. I've spent many years in multiple different industries, and it is really interesting to me that when I was in the middle of them, I didn't see those designs, but when I separated myself from that, I began to recognize how that proliferated so many different industries. So here on the left, you see the business as a machine where, sales or departments are cogs and profits are the end of that funnel as such. And then on the right, we get a state in the US as an economic engine. So even communities being seen like that. We also see it in people, right? This is an old textbook where it was showing an individual as a machine, where their arms were levers, their lungs were pumps, and then just different icons of where we're using our brain as how do we reset our buttons, right? And the idea of our brain as cogs or levers. It's a substantial way that we actually see how things are running and operating. And it's interesting, this is a really famous billionaire, and he has a blog that he puts out. And this is what he said just recently on one of his blogs to over 27,000 people. Think of yourself as a machine, and a machine operating within a machine, and know that you have the ability to alter your machines to produce better outcomes. Now, knowing that all of this is happening, our businesses are seen like machines, our societies are seen like machines, our bodies are seen like machines, our minds are seen like machines, it really begins to start, we have to ask this question. What's the consequences of treating organizations as machines and humans as parts of the machines? What is the consequence of that? You can type it in your chat function again.
Dan says everyone's disposable.
That was quick. That's right. And I don't know about you, but when you've been a part of organizations where this has been its primary paradigm, you do feel replaceable. You do feel disposable. And actually, to use a word that sometimes I'm not sure we understand the meaning of, we're all commodities. We're just the same across multiple different roles. And so we began to recognize that this is not just showing up in human context, it shows up in the planet. The planet, when we treat and see the planet as a machine, we actually know that the life of the planet actually degenerates when we're continually in extract mode versus kind of a regenerate mode. We also see this, Gallup puts out all this incredible data on engagement rates. And in the US, we've seen it go up a little bit, but to recognize that at its highest level right now, in 2019, that engagement is only at 35% within US organizations is incredible. And to know that Gallup estimates it's about $500 billion a year of lost productivity as a result of that lack of engagement. We see that as tied to this particular design. And then to also recognize that we got a new generation that's jumping into the workforce and becoming in positions of decision making, and that their engagement at work is extremely low. The percentage continues to be as high as it is with other generations. And to know that we believe as a result of this kind of industrialized machine design is that it results in power and resources being in the hands of a few versus in a distributed way across the entire organization or even in a society. And so here, as we've seen examples of how even individuals find themselves having more wealth or more resources than an entire country. So we also recognize this shows up in equity issues, when we see this in our societies all over, that, that race continues to predict infant mortality, life expectancy, and what shows up in how we do what we do across multiple facets of our society. So we began to see this simply as a design issue. We believe all of this was constructed, and we believe all of this can be deconstructed. That the machine paradigm is something we adopted. It is not innate to who we are and how we should move forward in our society. And so with that, we want to recognize that if it's a design issue, what are some things that will help inform what the design should be? And knowing that it was an empowering metaphor, that we saw all kinds of pretty incredible things that came from the machine metaphor and design. We also recognize its foundation. This industrialized process is foundation for all kinds of rational thought and civilization, social justice, and all of Newton's laws. But we recognize there's some limitations to it. That when it's appropriate in the right place, it actually creates value, but in the wrong place, it actually degenerates the health of the system. And we're going to talk about how powerful it is to see a system through a health lens. But even scientists in the middle of this kind of paradigm recognized its inability to address what was happening in reality. And so even Einstein said that when we're dealing with phenomenological complex issues, that the scientific method in most cases fails. And he uses weather as an example of this. Now think about the great thinker of Einstein, him recognizing that our current design cannot capture the complexity of what is. And he said, we need something different. And so we want to talk briefly about what's driving some of those conversations. And part of it is us recognizing and understanding the types of problems that exist in our world. And I think that will help inform a little bit about our design. So there are three types of problems, and system science has been talking about these problems for a few decades, but it's really not hit mainstream design in a way that really has transformed how we continue to design and manage our organizations. On the far left, we see that this simple problem of, if we want to bake something, if we want to make something, we follow a recipe. We've got series of known steps. We've got assumptions that are manageable, and we got repeatable outcomes. That's a simple problem. But in the middle, we've got what we call a complicated problem. And that complicated problem really is a little more details to it. There's some blueprints that people may follow. There's still a series of known steps. The fact is they may have a lot more variables to those different types of steps, but there are still known assumptions, and the effects are truly manageable. But what we find that's clearly still the case is that we've got repeatable results. So like sending a rocket to into the outer space, or building a machine, or building a structure. All those things can be repeatable, even if there are a lot of different variables. However, when we talk about complexity, like supply chains and markets and economies and people and society, the inputs are interdependent. They're not just known inputs. They're not in an ingredients list. It's like it's coming from all kinds of different angles. Every situation is different. And our steps are not necessarily known. We act as if they are, but we're quickly in a situation where the assumptions and the consequences that happen are in a place that cannot be explained, and the outcomes are unpredictable. Now, understanding that that's the case, it's interesting if we begin to bucket this a little bit, because the fact of the matter is as we said earlier, in some problems like baking a cake or a complicated situation of making something or sending somebody to the moon, are things that we can repeat over and over again and actually get incredible outcomes. I mean, the advancements of technology and some of the discoveries we've made over the last a couple of centuries has been amazing. But that really is around one particular thing, things we make. We've shown incredible ability to do that. But when we move to complexity, we're talking about something very different. And we have not, as a society, found a way to better understand how we manage things. So what we're talking about is to make sure that when we have a complicated design, that we apply it to things we make, and that when we have a complex one, we use a different design process. So with that in mind, let's talk about this. What do you think this is, complicated or complex? You can type it into your chat function. Is this complicated or complex? You're waking up Christmas morning. Yep. You're trying to put something together for a son or a daughter who's getting up. You've got a list of what? Instructions, right? This is exactly it. It's complicated. And there's a complete set of instructions. We follow those instructions, and hopefully for some of us, we get an outcome, right? Now, what about this? Complicated or complex?
Got a lot of folks typing in the chat, complex.
That's exactly right. And important to recognize that there is a big difference. You know, one really needs a set of instructions. The other needs a completely different framework. So when we think about what needs to be different, that's what we want to begin to spend our time on. And organizations are beginning to embrace this, that we need to see organizations as complex adaptive systems. But we don't want them to be seen as technical systems. We actually want them to be seen as living systems, which is our ability to recognize the need to shift from this perception that what's going to save us is technology. But what actually we're moving into is not a digital or Facebook or a millennial age. It's actually an age of complexity where we're actually realizing that our known industrialized process, though as successful as it may have been in the complicated realm, does not serve us, actually degenerates us in a realm of complexity. And so we want to move to life as a metaphor. And with life as a metaphor, we're going to replace this idea of the machine. And so just to be clear, we're not talking about Hakuna Matata. We're not talking about, you know, singing a song where everybody gets along. No, there's some real challenges in managing this way. And that it's not really the circle of life, it's really cycles of life. We got to be in symbiosis with one another and recognize that the relatedness of things that are happening in the natural world, like a predator-prey relationship, or in our social systems when we're talking about equity issues. These are all cycles that we need to continue to manage as a part of our ongoing design. But as a part of that design, we begin to recognize there are a few people who've really stepped way outside of the realm of doing science to be able to give us a view into life through a lens of systems. And so it was the Santiago School for our one participant, Carolina from Chile, has really influenced our thinking around this. And the Santiago School took the first holistic approach to looking at life. And what was interesting is they mapped everything about the the simplest form of life, a bacteria. And they did all this research and testing, and they discovered two real key defining aspects of life, this idea of self-maintenance and self-regeneration. And they actually coined a beautiful term called autopoiesis, this idea of self-poetry or self-making. And so when we think about complex systems, that is what is a complex system. It's a living system. So what they also came up with as they did this research is this statement: life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. So this idea of living is regenerative, and regenerative is living. And so what we're wanting to do is continue to recognize that in a complicated or simple form of problems, we want to embrace that set of instructions because it does serve us. But when we're talking about life, we're wanting to regenerate the potential in those living systems, which means we've got to take a different approach. So these are 4 things that came from that discovery or that work, that research that was done, that idea of self-regeneration is not located in any one place. It's dependent on all the interconnected relationships, that life was an emergent property of all of those connected relationships, and that all of the parts were, in essence, self-regenerative or wholes within wholes. Now, what's interesting is what in the world does that have to mean for us? Well, think about it like this. On the left side, the human body, when it's in relationship, all of the different organs and different aspects of the human body actually work in concert with one another. And the human body as a whole represents life. But on the right-hand side, when it's in disconnection, we know how we could take our brain and our heart and actually separate it from the system and make it work, but it requires an enormous amount of energy. It's not regenerative in that way. And so when we're looking at it to the right side, actually, it's a form of death. And that is what we began to recognize. In Potawatomi, there's this idea that things are interrelated in such a way that you can't even separate them. So that interrelatedness is just an example. Great book called Braiding Sweetgrass talks about seeing the world not into these categories of masculine and feminine and nouns and verbs, or animate and inanimate, but actually in a pluralistic form, where everything is depending on everything else. And that it actually has different ways to describe what it is is it alive or not? And that's really what we're starting to really dive into here. It's just that the machine design really engineers this idea of a best practices, or as we saw, a series of steps. And within those series of steps, we are pushed, all of us are pushed, to begin to build prescriptions, right? Silver bullet solutions, as we said it. Hey, if it's worked there, let's just apply it there. But in a complex situation, those prescriptions actually degenerate the health of the system. Now, in contrast to that, we believe a living system actually begins to it forms a principled approach, not best practice, not series of steps, principles that we use for design that begin to facilitate this idea of flexible frameworks. And we believe in these flexible frameworks is the opportunity to regenerate the health of the system, the potential that we believe exists. We also recognize that everything in orange requires an enormous amount of energy. It can't regenerate itself because you actually need more energy to keep it alive, keep it moving, right? Like a machine. Whereas when we think about the living system, it requires less energy. So we think about the soil in a garden. When you create the conditions, that soil will produce life, and you don't need to augment it. It can produce life without augmentation. But then what we find ourselves, and we're continuing to recognize the need to shift from this machine paradigm to this living systems paradigm, we are all recognizing a substantial need to frame our perspectives and operations around that shift. And that's what we see as a regenerative organization, is continuing to work to move from a machine paradigm to this living systems paradigm. Now, with that being the case, let's talk about principles for a second. What do I mean by principles? Well, we've got 6 principles, and I just want to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about. So the first 3 principles: holism, mutualism, and uniqueness. Now think about, what would a design look like if we were using these principles to design in our organizations? For instance, in holism, your supply relationships are more they're more of a web than a supply chain, right? It's not a linear relationship. It's actually an interconnected relationship. And our products and programs are all dependent upon the health of the entire system, not just that one-to-one relationship. And that mutualism, we recognize that all of our success cannot be at the expense of our partners or the system. So integrating your clients into conversations will create all kinds of systemic abundance and resilience. And that the uniqueness should show up. Every whole is unique. And when you design your system to unleash the potential, you realize that's realized in your team members, partners, and communities, it's tied to recognizing them as not parts, not replaceable, not commodity, but real unique contribution to that environment. Then we recognize that it's 3 other principles that, when we think about living systems, the ability for it to evolve, or that it's distributed, or that it actually allows for the growth and health of its members. And that we know that if our organizations cannot change and adapt, we find ourselves in uncomfortable situations like COVID-19. And if we aren't going to redistribute power, we put a lot of stress on the system because it's focused on the few and not the whole. And that our systems, people in particular, are meant to mature and develop over time, not just be meaningful as a part in a cog or not. So for us, this approach changes the dynamics completely. Our ability to be a resource for one another as we embrace a living systems approach using these principles becomes a powerful way for us to release potential in these systems. And so when you think about this, I want to ask this question. I'm going to give you a moment. Which principle do you think resonates the most with you, and why? And feel free to start chatting. You can put it in the chat field. But I want to give you a second to just share, what is it? Why does holistic resonate with you, or mutualism, or nodal? But which principle resonates with you the most, and why? I'll give you a moment to think about that. Great, we've got a couple of saying holism. We're all related, we're all interconnected. Fantastic. What else? What others resonate with you? Oh, I love it. Holism, you can't escape your consequences. Evolutionary, community is the next level of evolution. Beautiful. Holism encompasses all the other elements. Love it. All this is great, guys. Fantastic. And that's exactly what we want to do, is to recognize that now when you think about these principles that resonate with you, when you design from these principles, it's going to be a different outcome. And we want to be able to encourage that kind of activity and process. So one of our greatest thinkers of all time, greatest designers of all times, said this, Buckminster Fuller. And if you've read his work, fantastic. If you haven't, I really encourage you to go research him. He said, work with life-centered principles and the universe pitches in to help. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, just the idea that you regenerate potential when you're in participation and partnership with life. You degenerate it when you silo us and you separate us and you act as if we're not related, which is a machine. And so I love Buckminster Fuller being able to say, let's release it. Let's get focused on these life-centered principles and realize that the universe is going to step in and begin to work with us versus beginning to understand what is working against us. So with that, I also want us to know that this whole principled approach facilitates this idea of flexible frameworks. And so we've developed what we call the regenerative framework. And what's interesting about this, there's some things you may recognize. How an organization could understand its purpose, or what are the structures of an organization, and what work are we actually doing, the strategic planning and products and programs and technology and tools. But what is really different about this framework is we believe a living system actually sets potential in motion based on one thing, the health of the system. So we ask, is the system healthy? Is it building capacity around health, or are we doing work at the expense of the health of the system? And I think what we were sharing earlier around this idea of what happens when you're treating organizations as machines and people as parts of a machine is to recognize that it actually is degenerating the health of the system. And when it degenerates the health of the system, you will get full-on disengagement. And actually, from a societal standpoint, I actually think you get real, true health issues, mental health issues, emotional, physical, because we're not treating people as a part, unique contributors and bringing their genius as a part of the design. We're actually saying we don't need you but for this one particular thing. And when you are used up, you are thrown away. And all of that has to change. And our organizations have to lead in that way. So with that, what we believe is you get to see outcomes that you would have never, ever expected. Now, what do I mean by that? Our partner, the Savory Institute, who I've had a real incredible relationship with over the last decade of seeing incredible things happen around the world, they focus their attention in taking this kind of approach and applying it to natural systems. So this is a real life photo in the desert in Mexico. Actually met the individuals who were working in this rangeland down in the Sonora Desert. And what they did is they took this approach and said, now how can we re-envision? How can we change management to create a different outcome? And so when a lot of us see this, we just think, man, bare ground and animals that are struggling and not very much vegetation. But in a regenerative approach, what we see here is unrealized potential, because nature wants us to work with her, not against her. And so when we see unrealized potential and we begin to manage with and in partnership, over a 10-year period of time, these are some of the outcomes that we can see. Real, incredible abundance and resilience where the system begins to work in concert with one another. And as Buckminster Fuller says, right, the universe shows up in incredible, incredible ways. Now, just imagine your organizations. Imagine people who've been disengaged. Imagine parts of a team not working. Imagine all the things. And what we do is say, it's the fault of the individual. Well, what about the environment? What about the environment that's either hurting or helping us to create these kinds of outcomes? This is what we believe a living systems approach will do in a regenerative way, using and recognizing that we need to participate in a co-created, co-designed process. So then we recognize that, yes, it's going to take some real energy to shift. There's some real tensions and shifts that need to happen. We've got to move from best practices. The system cannot continue to regenerate itself with a set of instructions. We need principles. We need flexibility, right? We need the ability for you to create. And it's not because it worked there. It's because you've engaged your genius. And that it can't be about prescriptions. It's got to be about responsive frameworks that's adaptable and flexible, being able to change with the existing environment. And that we need to move from this idea of command and control dominance to interdependence. That we need to move from competition to cooperation. And so we begin to see that prediction isn't where we're trying to, we can't get into a living system and be able to predict it. But what we can do is begin to see patterns, that we want to create conditions for health and emergence, and that we're going to give up on this extraction model. Machines can only move forward when we extract natural resources as a means to begin keeping it moving in a direction that it wants to move, right? And so what can we do to move from that to equity, where people are the energy source, not money, not cash, right? And that we're focusing on the development of the whole versus the few. Now, it doesn't mean that cash isn't a tool, but what we don't want to do is make that interchangeable. We don't want people as tool and cash as the resource, right? The creativity, innovation comes from people, not from money. And that we want to move from this centralized power to decentralized empowerment. So we will then focus our attention on these shifts and recognize that, yes, it's a lot of work, but this is what's going to free us up. And this is the approach that will change the world that we live in today. I truly, truly believe that. So we use this working definition of regeneration, that it's a living, evolving, and a naturally functioning organization where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. And when we create the conditions, when we recognize that it's living, not a machine, and that we can evolve, and that we need to design within its natural capabilities, what we want is abundance and resilience or productivity to be recurring outcomes of its health, not at its expense. And so we use this to guide us as we continue to support organizations, support individuals as they are moving down this journey of regeneration. One of our just greatest system thinkers of all time, Donella Meadows, she said this. She says, the world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, psychological, economic system. And I'm going to say this, unfortunately, it's my words, we treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. And our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. And you may have not seen it before, and I hope that you see it today, that when we're dealing with complex systems, when we're dealing with society, when we're dealing with people, us, we need to have a different approach. We can't use people up because we can. We need to create the conditions for people to release potential that I believe they're there to release. And so what I want you to do is just ask this question. What has shifted for you today and why? If everything I'm talking about is true, or even if you're not sure it's true, what's happening in your head right now? What is starting to shift for you? And why is that shift happening? Just give you a minute or so to think about that. And if something's coming to you right away, just drop it into the chat field. Thank you, Dan. Wealth and profit can be measured in more people, environment-centric ways. Awesome. More clarity and reflections on a shift that was happening anyway. Great. This is familiar ground for me. Where I struggle with is this patriarchal power structure that is more interested in extracting the last cent out of the system. Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Part of the challenge for all of us is it's going to require institutional shifts, it's going to require organizational shifts, and it's going to require individual shifts. And the intention here is to embrace it. Begin to ask the questions. So I'm going to end with this, and we can open it up for questions. But what we all realize is that we should be patient toward all of what is unsolved in our hearts. And as Rilke said, try to love the questions themselves like locked rooms, like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue, right? Do not seek the answers, which cannot be given you right now anyhow, because you would not be able to live into them. The point is to live everything, to live the questions now. And perhaps you'll find them gradually, without noticing it, and live long some distance stay into the answer. And so for us, our challenge and opportunity for you is just keep asking those deep questions. Keep questioning why the design continues to be a machine design when we're a complex living system, and what do we need to do it differently. So thanks for your time today, guys.